Welcome back to the Ed Show. ISIS called the brutal murder of American journalist James Foley an act of retaliation for U.S. airstrikes in Iraq. ISIS demanded the airstrikes stop or Steven Sotloff, another American journalist, will be killed. Now we're learning until the airstrikes began last month, ISIS had a very different demand. A ransom payment of 100 million euros or roughly $132 million. The United States refused to pay, following the policy of not making concessions to terrorists and not paying ransoms. However, U.S. officials tell NBC News President Obama did authorize a rescue mission earlier this summer. U.S. troops were sent into Syria in an attempt to retrieve Foley and other American hostages held by ISIS militants. U.S. fighter jets provided cover for special operation forces and helicopters as they swarmed a compound in Syria. Intelligence agencies believed they had identified the location where the hostages were being held. Special ops engaged in a gun battle with ISIS forces and quickly determined the hostages were not actually there. On Wednesday, President Obama said the United States will be relentless against ISIS in the wake of Foley's murder. That same day, U.S. military announced 14 more airstrikes in northern Iraq. Officials say the military is now considering sending an additional 300 troops to the region. ISIS committed a barbaric act of terrorism against an American citizen, and certainly we have an obligation to see that justice is done. But many are wondering just what this means moving forward in Iraq. More troops, and what will the airstrikes do? And what kind of involvement will Congress have on this? I'm joined tonight by Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, who did vote against military force in Iraq some years ago. Congresswoman, I appreciate your time tonight. In the wake of the beheading of an American journalist and a threat to do it again, what do you see as the proper response here and the handling of this situation?
And certainly this brutal and barbaric murder of Mr. Foley really demonstrates just how dangerous ISIS is. And first, my thoughts and prayers and my sympathy goes out to Mr. Foley's family and friends. This is something that is mind-boggling and heartbreaking to the entire world, really. I think what we need to really realize, Ed, is that first of all, many of us supported limited and targeted airstrikes to prevent genocide and to protect United States personnel in Iraq. Any further military escalation, I believe, and I know Congressman McGovern, Congressman Jones, we passed a resolution last month saying that any escalation of military activity should be brought to Congress and we should engage in a full debate and a vote. There are many of us, I voted against the 2001 authorization. This was right after the horrific events of 9/11.
Yeah.
That was a blank check that gave authority to any president to use in perpetuity forever unless we go back and repeal that. I firmly believe we need to repeal these authorizations, go back to the drawing board with the most current information, and let Congress decide. We have a constitutional responsibility to do that.
Well, it is documented that ISIS has committed atrocities parallel that of the Nazis. And there is no question that ISIS is going to kill more people if we don't intervene here in a big way. Do you agree with the president and the stepped-up airstrikes that we're doing right now?
Well, let me say, these airstrikes continue to escalate, and we recognize that ISIS is very dangerous, and the president has always said, however, that there's no military solution, and that we need to really look at how we really deal with ISIS in a way that makes sense and that prevents further acts of genocide and further murders and killings. I believe, and I think others believe, that we have to have this debate in Congress, and we need to come up with and the American people really have to have their input. They're war weary, Ed. And so, yes, we have to figure out a real way to address ISIS, but we have to do this within the context of our constitutional responsibilities and duties, and that means we have to have a debate and have a vote in Congress with regard to any further military escalation.
Sending possibly 300 more troops is some form of escalation, or would that be just considered an isolated operation in your opinion?
In my opinion, this is further escalation. I've always said I'm very careful and cautious and vigilant about what we call mission creep, further escalation. And I think the president, though, has been very strategic, very prudent in how he has handled this. But I also know that we have to engage Congress more. The president has, under the War Powers Act, submitted congressional notification. Has done everything appropriately, but I also believe we're getting to that point now where this is becoming a further military escalation, and that the American people need to have their members of Congress in Washington debating this and going forward with a vote.
The United States and the United Kingdom refuse to pay ransoms, according to the New York Times. Other European countries have paid al-Qaeda and its affiliates $125 million in ransom payments, I guess, over the last 5 years. What do you think should be done to address this difference in policy, this discrepancy in policy, which puts American lives at a greater risk? And I guess even further to the point, do you believe that this country should pay ransom to get hostages back?
Well, let me say, first of all, ransom is one tool in a toolbox that the president has of all kinds of national security strategies that he may or may not use. I think it's very important that we have our policy consistent with Europe and with other nations in the world, because if one country or two countries pay ransom, if other countries don't, we put Americans and others in danger of being abducted. Also, the ransom policy, I believe, began under the no ransom policy began under the Bush administration. Part of this had to do with preventing terrorists from becoming wealthy, and they're breaking up many of their financial networks. So this is a very complicated issue, but it certainly has to be dealt with and addressed. And the issue of ransom, I believe, will only work, paying or not paying ransom, if in fact America and our European allies are in sync and in coordination with one policy.
Congresswoman, does it trouble you, the stories coming out about how well-funded, how well-organized, and how strong ISIS is? A threat unlike we have seen in the past, stronger than al-Qaeda, and certainly more driven ideologically. Does that trouble you, or does that change the dynamic in how you view any of this? You just wanted to go to Congress, it sounds like.
No. I view ISIS as very dangerous. I think the Attorney General, the President, everyone understands that this is a very dangerous organization, well-financed, well-funded. It's a terrorist group, and we have seen what they have done. I believe the facts of ISIS and other groups around the world that are perpetrating this kind of mayhem around the world, we need to have in Congress a debate, and we have to know the facts, and we need to know what the national security threats really are to the United States and to others, and we need to know what military strikes will or will not accomplish, and in fact, if there is a non-military solution, I mean, Iraqis and the region have to come to grips, and I believe they're on the path now to finding political settlements to many of the very major underlying difficulties that have given rise to all of this. But I do believe that we have to recognize that ISIS is dangerous, they're brutal, and we have to have a debate so that the American people understand what the possibilities are in terms of our strategies. And I'm very concerned, though, that the escalation of military strikes will insert the United States into a conflict where we may or may not need to be, but any further action should be brought to Congress immediately.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thank you for your time tonight. Appreciate it very much. Up next,